30 years with the CIA, 1964 to 1994.
I worked for the government for 35 years, starting with the Marine Corps from 1964 to 1968 with some service in Vietnam.
I was 25 years as a professional intelligence officer with CIA.
Almost 5 years in the Pentagon, and the last almost 3 of that working in the Office of Secretary of Defense.
Spent almost 20 years with the State Department, 3 years in Athens as a political counselor, the chief of the political section.
I'm a retired colonel of the United States Army, military intelligence, special forces.
I'm a former senior estimates officer with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I started actually as a science fellow at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and became the chief scientist of the Arms Control Agency.
For 27 years was an analyst first of Soviet affairs and then of wider responsibilities.
Well, I'm a congressman representing the 30th District in Los Angeles.
I've just completed almost 3 decades of service to the United States.
Most recently, I was an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon from 1994 to 2001.
I served for 23 years in the American Foreign Service as a diplomat.
I worked for the CIA for 28 and a half years.
I joined the agency in 1988, originally with what was then known as the National Photographic Interpretation Center.
I'm Washington editor of the Nation magazine. I've been doing that for about 16 years now.
I'm the Labour MP for a constituency in Birmingham called Birmingham Ladywood. I've been the MP for 20 years.
For 30 years I was a diplomat serving my country abroad. My last position, however, was as ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War.
In July of 1970, the President asked me to come over to the White House Council. And I served for roughly 1,000 days until it all fell apart.
Spent 23 years as a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I came back to public service in 2001 to be the Secretary of the Army.
Spent 21 years in the CIA. Of that time, I spent 90% in the Middle East.
I'm a former weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq. I served in that capacity from 1991 to 1998.
I worked for the CIA for 20 years, from 1966 to 1986.
I've worked on assessing secret nuclear weapons programs for almost 20 years.
Never expected that I'd leave the Navy and become the chief spook of our country, the director of Central Intelligence, but that happened.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
A clear threat to the United States.
There's dozens of ballistic missiles.
It has sponsored and sheltered terrorists.
Paying suicide
bombers.
Chemical
weapons are equally true.
Biological weapons, including anthrax and botulism toxin.
Biological and chemical agent to kill millions of people.
Chemical weapons, including VX and sarin, mustard gas.
To a massive and sudden horror.
Massive death and destruction.
Death on a massive scale.
The danger to our country is grave. The danger to our country is growing. The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons. The Iraqi regime is building the facilities necessary to make more biological and chemical weapons. And according to the British government, the Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes after the order were given. The regime has long-standing and continuing ties to terrorist organizations, and there are al-Qaeda terrorists inside Iraq. The regime is seeking a nuclear bomb, and with fissile material could build one within a year.
The Bush administration made up its mind to go to war on September the 11th, 2001. From that time on, you were dealing with rationalization and justification for the war. You weren't dealing with real causes for the war or real reasons for the war. There was never a clear and present danger. There was never an imminent threat.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass death.
Weapons of mass destruction was a convenient way of tricking our Congress into giving the president authority to wage this war.
Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
Develop nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons.
Here the intelligence community did a pretty good job. I think for the most part they made it clear that the evidence was not there to show that Iraq was trying to reconstitute its nuclear capability, let alone whether or not it had a nuclear capability, which it didn't.
Leaders will use worst-case assessments that point to nuclear weapons to generate political support because they know people fear nuclear weapons so much.
The intelligence that we were operating off was correct.
The quality of our intelligence operation, I think we're better than anybody else.
We gathered a lot of intelligence.
Going to war based on intelligence is yet another example, I think, of intelligence simply not being able by nature, by definition, to live up to that kind of requirement. You may produce intelligence that could keep you out of a war, but I doubt that you'll ever get 1, 2, 3 reports of intelligence that will in any way allow you to go to war.
That intelligence was good, sound intelligence.
After the war, we have an internal review within the CIA conducted by a guy named Richard Kerr, who used to be the deputy director of the CIA. A CIA loyalist, enthusiast, and he at this point was telling reporters who bothered to ask that his initial findings were that the intelligence produced by the CIA was based on circumstantial, inferential evidence. They hadn't come up with any hard evidence since 1998 when the inspectors left, and that it always came with caveats and qualifiers.
There were pretty robust debates among the various people who gathered and assessed information, but that as somehow as it went up higher in the chain of command, finally reaching the White House, that there was a selective use of information to make their case.
I think this particular time, what has been very disturbing to my current colleagues, is the extent of massive intervention by people, particularly from Vice President Cheney's office and Vice President Cheney himself, in the process, and the very heavy leaning on the Director of Central Intelligence and his staff to produce precisely the language, let me say, which would allow them to make the statements which they have been making to support the decision to go into Iraq.
They call this data mining, going back over old information and coming with new conclusions. The whole purpose of the CIA was to leave those people out of Langley. That's why they're not in Washington, they're in Northern Virginia, away from the White House, away from Congress. Leave them alone, ask them what they think, but don't tell them to rethink their positions, because then you come up with nonsense, like we saw.
I think when you begin to distort the evidence, it leads you into some very dangerous rationale. And I think the administration has not been honest with what its longer range goals and philosophy were.
But we now know that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Among other sources, we've gotten this from first-hand testimony from defectors, including Saddam's own son-in-law.
His son-in-law's name was Hussein Kamel. It turned out that he also said that at his command, and he was in charge of the biochemical and nuclear weapons programs, at his command all these things had been destroyed in 1991. And it wasn't really revealed until an enterprising British scholar went and got the debriefing report from Vienna and discovered that Kamel, highly touted Kamel, also said that at his command, and he was in command, they were destroyed.
Why was Hussein Kamel so cavalierly ignored, in essence, when he made his claims in 1995 that, you know, after I've given you the aflatoxin and the other anthrax-filled bombs and warheads, that's it. That's all that was left. Everything else is just the infrastructure for the program that we can restart once you got